I never thought I'd meet someone worth remembering at the DMV. Let me be clear. The DMV is my personal hell, the kind of place where time seems to warp and patience runs dry like a desert after a drought. So there I was, stuck in the usual slow-moving line, clutching a crumpled number ticket that promised nothing but waiting. I was already halfway through rehearsing my "I'm totally fine, just stuck at the DMV" face for every possible interaction when he appeared. He was standing maybe 5 people ahead of me, and the first thing I noticed was the way he kept smiling. Not one of those polite, forced smiles people give when they're trying not to lose their minds standing in line, but a genuine, slow-building grin that seemed almost out of place in that fluorescent-lit purgatory. I glanced over a few times, trying to figure out what was so funny, or maybe what he was thinking about, but his eyes were just soft and calm, like he was holding some secret amusement that the rest of us weren't in on. I'm usually pretty good at blending into the background, especially in situations like this, where the goal is to get in and out as fast as possible without attracting attention. But something about the way he smiled made me want to break my own rules. So instead of staring at my phone or sighing at the slow shuffle forward, I found myself looking at him. And then, when he caught me looking, he smiled at me directly, like a little wave that said, "Hey, I know this please mess, but maybe it's not all bad." I figured, why not? So I shifted slightly closer in line, hoping to catch whatever vibe he was putting out without seeming creepy or desperate. The line barely moved, and the minutes stretched on, but honestly, the guy's smile was a weird kind of bright spot in the middle of all the DMV gloom. I didn't even catch his name that first time. We never said more than a few words, mostly just small talk about the eternal wait, the ridiculous number of forms you need for one simple thing, and the universal hatred for that one clerk who seemed to move at the speed of a tortoise on sedatives. But every time I looked over, there he was, grinning like he was in on some joke I hadn't yet heard. At one point, when the line barely budged for what felt like an eternity, he leaned over and said, "You ever think about how weird it is that everyone hates coming here, but we all keep coming back?" And honestly, I didn't have a good answer. I just nodded and said, "I guess it's just one of those things you have to deal with." He laughed softly and looked back down the line, his smile still there, like it was a shield against the frustration of the place. And in that moment, something about him seemed less ordinary than everyone else shuffled around us, impatient and cranky. I don't know if it was the smile or the way he seemed to find some weird peace in the middle of chaos, but I wanted to know more. Little did I know, that smile and that moment at the DMV would turn out to be the start of something neither of us expected. Something way more complicated, messy, and beautiful than a simple license renewal could ever be. But for now, all I could do was stand there, waiting, and wonder who this guy was, and why his smile was suddenly the best thing about the worst day of my life. Eventually, the line moved just enough for us to inch closer to the counter, and, honestly, I was relieved. Not because I was eager to get my paperwork done, though that was part of it, but because I didn't want to be stuck in the same spot with no way to talk for much longer. The tension of the waiting was starting to feel a little less like boredom, and more like this weird mix of anticipation and curiosity. I didn't even know his name, but I found myself wanting to know it. When we got close enough, I finally worked up the nerve to say, "Hey, I'm Mark, by the way." He turned toward me, still smiling, and said, "Nice to meet you, Mark." "I'm Ethan." "Ethan," I repeated, liking the way the name sounded. It had a calm, familiar ring to it. "So what brings you to the DMV today? New license, renewal, lost yours in a tragic karaoke incident?" He laughed. A real laugh this time, the kind that makes your chest feel lighter. More like trying to get my first license. I'm turning 18 next week, so I figured it was about time. I blinked. First license? Man, I'm old. I'm 28. He shrugged like it was no big deal, but I felt a little embarrassed for being so much older. Better late than never, right? Yeah, I guess. I chuckled, trying to shake off the sudden awkwardness. "So, what made you decide to come today then?" Usually, people wait until the last minute. Ethan's eyes twinkled with that same smile. I wanted to get it out of the way before school starts. Plus, I figured it'd be more fun to wait in line with an interesting stranger. I laughed again, surprised by how easy it was to talk to him. Usually, I'm not great with small talk, especially with strangers, but Ethan had this way of making it feel natural, like we were old friends catching up. He glanced down the hall and then back at me. "You're not from around here, are you?" "Nope, I just moved here a few months ago for work, still figuring out the city." "Same," he said. "I was born here, but haven't spent much time outside my neighborhood. It's kind of comforting to meet someone who's figuring things out too." That hit me in a way I didn't expect. I guess I always thought everyone had their stuff together, especially people who seemed as calm as Ethan. But here he was, just as uncertain as me, maybe even more so. Our conversation slowed as the line shuffled forward again, and I realized I'd been looking at him for longer than I meant to. But instead of feeling awkward, I felt kind of connected. Like the DMV wasn't a nightmare at all, but the place where something unexpected was starting to happen. When we finally reached the counter, we ended up at adjacent windows, which was almost comical given how crowded the place was. I caught Ethan's eye and smiled, and he winked back. The clerk at my window was slow, as expected, but I found myself less annoyed than usual. Maybe it was because Ethan was just a few feet away, or maybe it was the way his smile kept showing up in my peripheral vision like a beacon. After I finished, I turned to leave, but Ethan stopped me. "Hey, since we're both new to this whole adult life thing, want to grab a coffee? There's a place down the street that's way better than the vending machine here." I hesitated for a second. Normally, I'd brush off an invitation like that, but something about him made me want to say yes. "Yeah, sure, why not?" We walked out of the DMV together, the sun blinding after the harsh fluorescent lights inside. The city buzzed around us, but for some reason, the only thing I noticed was Ethan's smile. At the cafe, the conversation picked up easily. He told me about his plans for college, his dreams of traveling, and how he figured getting that license was the first step toward a little more independence. I told him about my job, how I'd moved here not just for work, but to get a fresh start after a rough breakup. It felt good to share things I usually kept to myself, especially with someone who seemed to listen with genuine interest. At one point, I caught him looking at me like he was trying to figure me out, and I realized I was doing the same. There was something about Ethan, something warm and real, that made me want to take a chance, even if I wasn't sure what that chance would look like. As the afternoon faded into early evening, the streetlights clicked on, and the city took on a different kind of energy. We sat there, sipping coffee, talking about everything and nothing, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt this, live. When it was time to go, Ethan hesitated, then said, "Hey, maybe I could show you around sometime? There's a lot about this city I haven't seen either." I smiled, feeling that same spark that had been there in the DMV line, that quiet promise of something new. I'd like that. We exchanged numbers, and as I walked away, I caught myself grinning like an idiot. Who knew that a place like the DMV could start something like this? But the best part, that smile, the one Ethan kept flashing despite the long line and the boredom, was still stuck in my head, and I had a feeling it wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. The days after that coffee felt kind of surreal. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting a message from Ethan, even though we'd only just exchanged numbers. When his name popped up that evening, I swear my heart gave this weird little flip that I wasn't used to. He texted something like, "Had fun today. Want to meet up this weekend and explore that art gallery you mentioned?" I typed back quickly, "Absolutely. I've been wanting to check it out for ages." It wasn't like I was desperate or anything. I mean, I wasn't exactly the smoothest guy out there, but there was this easy, comfortable vibe with him that felt different. I wasn't trying to impress him. I was just myself, which was rare. Saturday rolled around, and I found myself actually excited to leave my apartment early. The city had this strange charm when the sun was out, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I belonged somewhere. I showed up at the entrance of the gallery a few minutes early, and sure enough, there was Ethan, leaning casually against the wall with that same smile, like he'd been waiting just for me. "Hey," he said as I approached, eyes bright. "You're early. Impressive." "I'm trying to make a good impression," I teased. We both laughed, and just like that, the awkwardness I sometimes feel with new people seemed to vanish. Inside the gallery, we wandered between paintings and sculptures, swapping thoughts about the art, but mostly just talking about life, our families, the weird quirks about city living, favorite music. At one point, Ethan stopped in front of a piece that was abstract, swirls of blue and gold that seemed to represent some kind of storm. "Kinda like life, huh?" he said quietly. "Messy and chaotic, but if you look close enough, there's beauty in it." I looked at him, surprised by how thoughtful he sounded. "Yeah, I never thought about it like that." He shrugged, that grin creeping back. "What can I say? I like to find this silver lining." It hit me then how that might explain his smile during the DMV line. Maybe he just had this knack for staying positive when everything else was falling apart. The more time I spent with Ethan, the more I realized I liked not just his smile, but the way he seemed to accept things and people without judgment. It was refreshing, especially after the last relationship I'd had, which was full of tension and trying to be perfect. At some point during the gallery tour, we found ourselves sitting on a bench in the corner, the noise of the other visitors fading into the background. I looked over at him and felt this strange urge to say something real, something that mattered. But words didn't come easily. Instead, I just smiled back, and he squeezed my hand gently. It was the first time our hands touched, and it felt electric in the best way. Before I could embarrass myself with some awkward comment, he leaned in and whispered, "I'm glad we met." "Me too." I managed, heart pounding. After the gallery, we wandered through a nearby park, the afternoon sun casting long shadows. We talked about everything and nothing, future plans, favorite movies, stupid childhood memories. At one point, Ethan stopped by a fountain and tossed in a coin, making a wish, he said. I watched him, then did the same. I don't even remember what I wished for exactly, but I felt hopeful. As the day came to an end, we walked back toward the subway, the air cooling down. I felt a mix of happiness and nervousness, the kind that comes with the possibility of something new but uncertain. When we reached the station, Ethan looked at me and said, "I don't want this to end." "Me neither," I admitted. He hesitated, then asked, "Can I see you again soon?" "Definitely," I said, my voice a little breathy. He smiled, that smile, the one that had started it all, and leaned in to kiss me softly. It wasn't perfect or flashy. It was gentle and real, like the rest of our time together. When we pulled apart, he whispered, "I'm really glad I smiled in line that day." I chuckled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "Yeah, me too." As I rode the subway home, replaying the day in my mind, I realized something. Sometimes the most unexpected places, like the DMV, can be where the best stories begin. And with Ethan, I was ready to see where ours would go. After that first kiss at the subway station, everything felt different, like the city itself was suddenly charged with possibility. I caught myself smiling more, noticing little things I'd usually overlook, the way sunlight filtered through the buildings, the sound of distant street music, the way Ethan's laugh echoed in my mind long after we'd parted. We started seeing each other more regularly, not in some whirlwind, but in a way that felt natural and easy. Lazy Sunday brunches, spontaneous walks through the park, sometimes just hanging out in our apartments binge-watching shows, with takeout piled between us. It was comfortable in a way I hadn't felt in years. One night, a couple of weeks after that first gallery date, Ethan invited me over to his place. It was a modest apartment on the third floor of a building that looked like it had been there since forever. The windows were open, and I could hear the city sounds drifting in, a mix of distant sirens, honking horns, and the murmur of people passing by. He had this little record player set up in the corner, spinning some soft indie tunes that filled the room with a mellow vibe. Ethan was in his element, casual but focused, as he cooked dinner. I sat at the small kitchen table, watching him move around, the way his brow furrowed slightly when he was concentrating on slicing vegetables. We talked about everything, his hopes for college, my job frustrations, the weird quirks of our families. It was one of those evenings where silence felt comfortable, not awkward. At one point, he looked at me and said, I was nervous the first day we met. Didn't expect to click with anyone at the DMV. I laughed. Neither did I. DMV doesn't exactly scream romance. He smiled that same smile, the one that had pulled me in from the start. Guess sometimes the worst places surprise you. Later, as we sat on the couch with plates balancing precariously on our knees, the conversation turned more personal. I told him about my last relationship, how it ended with more questions than answers, and how I'd been hesitant to open up again. Ethan listened without interrupting, his eyes steady and patient. When I finished, he reached out and took my hand. "I'm not here to fix anything," he said softly, "but I want to be someone you trust. No pressure, no expectations, just us." It hit me how rare that kind of honesty was. I squeezed his hand back, feeling something loosen inside me. A knot I hadn't realized was there. Over the next few weeks, our connection deepened in small ways. Shared playlists, late-night texts about everything from silly memes to deeper thoughts, surprise visits to hole-in-the-wall bookstores, and even that time we got caught in the rain and ended up laughing under a bus stop shelter for nearly an hour. One afternoon, we decided to visit a little coffee shop Ethan had been telling me about for ages. It was a cozy place tucked away from the main street, walls lined with books and local art. I remember sitting there, hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching Ethan animatedly describe a book he'd just read. Then, out of nowhere, he reached over and brushed a stray hair off my forehead. The gesture caught me off guard, not because it was romantic, but because it was tender, intimate in a way that felt new and exciting. I looked up at him, and he was already watching me, eyes soft with something I couldn't quite put into words. "Do you ever think about what it means to really let someone in?" he asked quietly. I thought about that for a moment. I used to be scared of it, honestly. Letting someone see the parts of me I usually keep hidden. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, me too." Then he leaned in, and before I knew it, our lips met again, this time with more certainty, more promise. It wasn't just a kiss. It felt like a beginning. But as much as things were blossoming, life wasn't without its complications. One night, I got a call from my old roommate back home. Apparently, my ex had been asking about me, dropping hints that maybe we should talk. It threw me off balance, stirring up feelings I thought I'd buried. I found myself wrestling with old doubts. Was I ready for something new? Could I trust myself to not mess this up again? I didn't want to bring it up to Ethan right away. I wasn't sure how to explain the jumble of emotions without sounding like I was dragging baggage into our fresh start, but Ethan, somehow, seemed to sense it anyway. One evening, as we sat on his balcony watching the city lights blink on, he reached out and took my hand again. "Whatever's on your mind," he said gently. "You don't have to carry it alone." I looked at him, the words catching in my throat. For the first time, I let myself be vulnerable in a way I hadn't since before. "I just got some news from back home. It's complicated." My ex reached out, and it's stirring up old stuff. Ethan nodded, squeezing my hand. "I get it. I've got my own ghosts, you know? But none of that changes what we have here." His words felt like a balm. I realized then that this wasn't just a casual thing for either of us. We were starting to build something real, something that required trust and openness. That night, we talked for hours about fears, hopes, and the messy reality of trying to move forward while carrying pieces of the past. By the time dawn crept in, I felt lighter. Not because everything was solved, but because I wasn't facing it alone. Looking back, it's wild to think it all started with a smile in a DMV line, a smile that kept showing up, steady and genuine, like a lifeline in the middle of chaos. Ethan's smile became the anchor I didn't realize I needed. A reminder that sometimes, the worst days can lead to the best moments if you're willing to take a chance. And that's exactly what I was ready to do. The days that followed that deep conversation on Ethan's balcony felt like walking on a tightrope. Part 3. I kept replaying everything we'd said, the way he didn't flinch when I shared the messy parts of my past, and how his presence somehow made those ghosts feel less heavy. But life, as it tends to do, threw a curveball. It was a Thursday evening when Ethan called me, just as I was about to settle in with some takeout. His voice was quieter than usual, tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "Hey, can we talk? Like, in person?" My stomach flipped. "Yeah, of course. What's up?" When I got to his place, Ethan was sitting on the couch, hands folded awkwardly. He looked kind of off, not the usual calm, smiling guy I'd gotten used to. "I've been offered an internship," he blurted out, "in Seattle." My heart dropped. Seattle was thousands of miles away, an entire world apart from the little bubble we'd built here. That's great, right? I forced a smile, even though my voice cracked a bit. "I mean, it's a big opportunity," he nodded, eyes avoiding mine. "Yeah, it's amazing, but it starts in 2 months, and I don't know what that means for us." The air between us tightened. I wanted to say all the right things, to promise I'd support him no matter what, but inside I felt like everything was unraveling. "I don't want to lose what we have," Ethan said quietly, "but I also can't ignore this chance." I rubbed my hands over my face, trying to gather my thoughts. It felt like the world was asking me to make a choice before I was ready. "Hey," I finally said, "we don't have to figure everything out right now. Let's just take it one day at a time." He looked up, the familiar smile flickering back like a candle in the dark. "One day at a time. I like that." In the weeks that followed, we lived in this weird in-between state, excited about the future, but anxious about the distance it would bring. We made plans to visit, talked late into the night to keep the connection alive, but there was an unspoken tension, like we were both bracing for impact. Trying to distract myself, I threw myself into work and even started taking weekend photography classes. Something about framing a moment, capturing light and shadow, helped me process everything swirling inside. One evening, after a particularly frustrating day, I found myself texting Ethan without really thinking. "I miss you," I typed, then stared at the screen, heart pounding before I hit send. His reply came seconds later. "I miss you too." That simple exchange reminded me how tethered we'd become, even with the miles creeping closer. The night before Ethan was supposed to leave, we met at the park where we'd shared so many conversations. The air was crisp, and the city lights twinkled around us. We sat on the bench, the silence heavy, but not uncomfortable. "I'm scared," I confessed. "Scared that distance will change everything." He took my hand, fingers intertwined with mine. "Me too. But if this is real, we'll find a way." We stayed there for hours, talking about possibilities, fears, and the kind of love that asks you to trust when you most want certainty. When it was finally time to say goodbye at the airport, Ethan hugged me tight. "Promise me something?" "Anything. Promise you won't stop smiling, even when it's hard." I laughed, feeling tears prick the corners of my eyes. "You're the one with the smile that started all this. Then I guess we're even." As he walked toward security, I realized that sometimes love isn't about perfect timing or easy answers. It's about the moments, the smiles, the courage to hold on even when the future feels uncertain. And as I stood there watching Ethan disappear into the crowd, I knew one thing for sure. That smile, the one I first saw in the DMV line, was a light I'd follow, no matter where it led. The weeks after Ethan left were, honestly, harder than I expected. It's one thing to say you'll take it one day at a time, and another to actually live it when the days feel so long and empty without someone you're used to having around. At first, we kept up with texts and late-night calls, sharing our days like usual. But there's this weird thing about distance. It makes the easy conversations harder and the silences lonelier. Sometimes, I'd catch myself reaching for my phone, only to remember he wasn't just in the next room anymore. One evening, about 2 weeks in, I was sitting on my bed, scrolling mindlessly through photos I'd taken in class, trying to distract myself when my phone buzzed. It was a video from Ethan. I tapped it open and watched him laughing, sitting on a rooftop with a group of new friends, the Seattle skyline behind him. I smiled at first, then felt this pang of jealousy mixed with warmth. He seemed happy, and I wanted that for him. But there was this gnawing fear that at some point, our worlds would drift too far apart. I shot him a quick reply. "Looks amazing there. Wish I was on that rooftop." His reply came almost immediately. "Next time, you're coming with me. Deal?" I grinned, feeling a flicker of hope. Deal. Still, it was clear things were shifting. Our conversations became more about logistics, when he'd visit, how long I could stay, what neighborhoods he liked. The raw, easy talk about dreams and insecurities faded a bit, replaced by the practical side of maintaining a long-distance relationship. One night, after a particularly quiet call, I found myself wondering if this was really sustainable. I didn't want to lose what we had, but I also couldn't ignore the growing distance, both physical and emotional. I decided to be honest. So the next day, I texted Ethan. "Can we talk?" "Like, really talk?" He responded quickly, "Of course." That evening, we set a video call. His face appeared on my screen, looking tired, but glad to see me. "I've been thinking a lot." I started, "About us, about how hard this distance is." "Yeah," Ethan said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Same here. It's tougher than I expected." "I don't want to lose you," I admitted. "But I also don't want us to become strangers." He nodded slowly. "I feel that too. Maybe we need to figure out a plan. Something more concrete." We talked for hours, discussing possibilities. Me moving to Seattle, him coming back for longer visits, how to keep the connection alive despite the miles. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the uncertainty felt overwhelming, and we both had to admit that love alone might not be enough. But through it all, there was this undercurrent of hope. We'd built something genuine, and it was worth fighting for. A few weeks later, Ethan surprised me with a flight ticket. "Come visit me next month," he said over the phone, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. I booked the trip, heart pounding with anticipation and nerves. The idea of seeing him in a new environment, experiencing his world firsthand, felt like a lifeline. When I arrived in Seattle, Ethan was waiting at the airport with that same smile, maybe even brighter than before. We spent the week exploring the city, wandering through Pike Place Market, hiking around Green Lake, and sitting in cozy coffee shops where we talked for hours. There was a new layer to us now. Being together in person after weeks apart made the connection feel more real, but also highlighted how much we had to navigate. At night, lying side by side in his small apartment, I felt this mixture of contentment. We were building something, but it wasn't perfect. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Ethan turned to me. "Mark, I know this is complicated, but I want to try. I want us to work, even if it's messy." I looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability there mirrored in my own. "Me too," I said. "I'm scared, but I'm in." We didn't pretend it would be easy. We talked about boundaries, communication, and what we needed to feel connected. The trip ended too soon, and saying goodbye at the airport was just as hard as the first time. But this time, I left with something stronger, a sense that no matter the distance, we were committed to growing together. Back home, life settled into a new rhythm. We planned visits, scheduled calls, and shared little parts of our days through photos and messages. There were tough moments, missed calls, busy schedules, days when the longing felt unbearable, but we kept holding on. I realized that sometimes love isn't about fireworks or grand gestures, but the quiet persistence of showing up for each other, even when it's hard. And through it all, Ethan's smile remained my anchor. The reminder that even in the waiting and the uncertainty, there's always a reason to keep hoping. Maybe our story started we found our rhythm, weekend visits, daily messages, little routines that made us feel connected even when miles apart. It wasn't perfect. There were missed calls and moments of loneliness, but it was real, built on honesty and the kind of trust that grows slowly, like roots taking hold underground before they blossom. One chilly evening, a few months after my trip to Seattle, Ethan surprised me with a visit. I was waiting for him at the train station, the city lights casting a soft glow on the wet pavement. When he stepped off the train, his eyes met mine, that familiar smile lighting up his whole face. It was the same smile that had caught my attention in that long, frustrating DMV line months ago, but now it carried something deeper: hope, commitment, and a quiet promise. We walked through the city, hands brushing until I finally took his, fingers lacing together naturally. We didn't need grand declarations or dramatic gestures. The simple act of holding his hand felt like the answer to all the questions that had lingered between us. Later, sitting in a small cafe, we talked about the future, not in vague terms, but in plans and possibilities. I told him I was considering transferring to a branch of my company in Seattle, and he shared his hopes about finishing school while building a life that included me. There was no rush, no pressure, just a mutual understanding that we wanted the same thing: to keep growing, together, wherever that might be. As we stepped outside, the night air crisp and clean, Ethan looked at me and said, "You know, I never thought a DMV line would lead me here." I laughed softly. Neither did I, but I'm grateful it did. He squeezed my hand gently. Me too. In that moment, under the quiet hum of city lights and distant traffic, I realized that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places. Our story wasn't about perfect timing or fairy tale romance. It was about two people choosing each other again and again, despite uncertainty and distance. And as we walked side by side, sharing laughter and quiet smiles, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a sense of home. Not a place, but a person. And for the first time in years, I was exactly where I was meant to be.